Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Saltworks this week. We are so excited you have joined us. We have a great passage for today. So let's go ahead and get into it. But before we do, good morning to Alex. How are you today, Alex?
Very well, Katie. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. And Japhet, how are you today?
Brilliant, happy, excited, because in Colorado sometimes it snows, sometimes it rains, sometimes it's cold, sometimes it's hot. We experience everything in the same day, so it's great.
Sounds great. All right, good to see you. All right, so let's go ahead and get into today's passage. We are talking about 1 Corinthians chapter 12, so there's lots of good stuff here. So let's go ahead and get into it. So Japhet, if you could pray, and then Alex, go ahead and read, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Heavenly Father, just wonderful for us to be able to connect. Thankful so much for the opportunity to be in your word. Thank you to be able to connect in this format as well, and ask for a blessing as we dive into Paul's writings here. We ask this in Jesus' beautiful name. Amen.
Amen. Well, I'm going to read the first 11 verses of the chapter, and I will read from the English Standard Version. However, in an American accent, not an English, Japhet, I'm sorry, but the ESV. So one of the great chapters. So here we go. Now, concerning spiritual gifts, brothers, I do not want you to be uninformed. You know that when you were pagans, you were led astray to mute idols, however you were led. Therefore, I want you to understand that no one speaking in the Spirit of God ever says Jesus is accursed, and no one can say Jesus is Lord except in the Holy Spirit. Now, there are a variety of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of service, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who empowers them all and everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. For to one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by the one Spirit, to another the working of miracles, to another prophecy, to another the ability to distinguish between spirits, to another various kinds of tongues, to another the interpretation of tongues. All these are empowered by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one individually as he wills.
Great, thanks, Alex. So, first question, do you remember the first time, or what is your first memory of learning about spiritual gifts? Or the first thing you remember about learning about the gifts?
Things that we should not talk about and things we should.
I don't remember the term spiritual gifts, Katie, until I got into my religion program when I was in college as a religion student and in seminary. I don't have any memory of it, but I remember it being a big topic then that was discussed at length. I think that the first time in my life that I thought about the concept of spiritual gifts, but I never would have had the terminology for it, is I remember my parents talking about it's called, most of our Saltworks family will know this, it was called the nominating committee in church. And I remember as a child, there would be a first reading, there would be a second reading, and we would vote to approve this long list of, and the term was officers of the church, who would serve as director of the primary division or assistant director of kindergarten, and etc. It would go. And so I have a childhood memory of this big deal when all of these, and I remember as a kid, Katie, mainly what I wanted to know, I was in juniors, like, who's going to be leading juniors this next year? So I remember looking for the list and go, yay, I love Mr. Jones or whatever his name was. So anyway, those are my, Japhet, I don't know. Those are my first memories.
Yeah, I had a different experience with spiritual gifts. I think the way that I remember this, the first time, Katie, that I remember the spiritual gifts coming up was related to speaking in tongues, and how it is that was where the whole discussion went. It was not actually the whole positive, beautiful thing that Paul's going in. It was just about, hey, let's just address this one, 3 words in the entire passage, and let's focus all of our energy inside here, and do we really know what it means, and is it not this particular tribe, and it is this tribe. And I remember a lot of effort was dispensed in that particular field. But then, later on you suddenly realize that actually there's so much more. But yes, that's what I remember. But nominating Biddy, oh, that's a whole other world.
Yeah. So Alex, it sounds like then with like nominating committee or Sabbath school, gifts can be often associated or at least thought of through how people contribute to how maybe the church functions. It sounds like could be like I've heard some people say like, oh, someone's spiritual gift is teaching, therefore they should teach in this, So it sounds like a lot of people can consider them as kind of almost categories in which they can serve, which isn't necessarily wrong, but it kind of just organizes things a little bit. So I like how Paul starts by saying, I don't want you to be uninformed. And then he explains these varieties. So if you were to explain to someone in today's context of Christianity who had never heard of spiritual gifts before, how would you do that?
I'll go first. Japhet and I are very polite.
Yeah, sure.
Very, very polite.
We are very polite.
So I think I would begin with there's an analogy, and hear me, it's not the same thing. And Katie, maybe we'll get into this, but there's some analogy in the business world of things like strengths finders.
Mm-hmm.
There are tools in the business world and the education world. I mean, we can all remember our college days when maybe we took a little test that told us what kind of jobs might you be good at in life. So I think that that's a bit of an analogy. So I begin by saying that as human beings, we have different strengths and weaknesses. We have abilities and gifts, and spiritual gifts, the concept, but I don't think it's the whole concept, but I think it's a beginning of a way to understand what makes Katie unique and the contribution she can make in the world. What is Alex like, Japhet like, etc. So I'm going to let Japhet take it from there, but that's the beginning of a description, which is spiritual gifts is a recognition that as human beings, we have different personality types, different skill sets, and we should acknowledge that.
Yeah, I think that the Strengths Finder and Strengths Quest route is actually really useful. I think also that I would, and I do today, often try to use the analogy of how different personalities, different stories, different characters bring so much to the table, and that if you understand someone, you treat them differently when you understand what the narrative is and what kind of person they are. And so kind of gathering that kind of like mentality is really important, that we shouldn't pigeonhole people into a particular stone because they play the piano so well, therefore that's actually the role that they should do always in the church, is just play the piano for kindergarten, Sabbath school or something like this. But actually maybe they're an artist, or maybe they're just methodical and they just know how to follow through and some stuff like this. So it's about actually finding out what people are built for, what they're wired for, and then finding what their sweet spot is. And I think Paul, what he was trying to do here was just trying to say, look, there's something that you can contribute, that God has given you as a gift. And so let's find that out. And that's what makes us beautiful. So
that's good.
Yeah.
I remember explaining to a student at some point, I forget how young they were, but they were pretty young, and they were asking, and we were studying what spiritual gifts were. And I remember explaining to her that it's like, or at least how I imagined it was like how when you bake something, you have all these ingredients, that can be used in different ways depending on, whatever they're baked into. So, a cookie ingredient is going to be different than like a cake, but when those ingredients all come together, you get this like perfection. So for me, I think of chocolate chip cookies because those are perfection to me. um but like when you put all of these things that do different functions together, what you get is like this glorious end product. And so how I explained it to them was, it's kind of like that, where these different ingredients can serve different functions in different capacities, but when you combine them just right, like you get something, I mean, sweet, chocolate chip cookies are sweet, but they all play off of each other and they come together to just form this really great thing. And so that's kind of how I understand them, is when they come together. They're good on their own, but when they come together, you really get something like super strong there. So I remember thinking, how do I explain this? But I think I was hungry that day. I don't know.
That's really good, Katie. They're not all good on their own, by the way. Flour
That's
goes,
true. That's
but
true.
some of them are good on their own. But yeah, I really like what you're driving out there, and I think it feels like you're getting at maybe the heart of Paul's concern in the beginning, which is something has gone wrong.
Yeah,
he's writing this because something is off here. The ingredients in the cupboard are not getting along with each other, apparently. So yes, I think your description of things coming together is spot on. And I think it suggests that somehow the mixing bowl's not working out so well.
Yeah. Yeah. So go ahead, Japhet.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's actually part of the context of the first few verses there in verse 1 to 3, that he's got, if you imagine, he's got a team and he's got a really couple of weird people in the team. And he's trying to say to the team, like, I've got some great people and I got some really weird people, and I would love everybody to be on the same page. And how do I get everybody to realize that, we should all be on the same page? Because the others are like saying, not everybody's pulling their weight, not everybody's doing the right thing. And how do we get everybody on the same page here? So he's trying to refocus the entire church community as to what is the grounding value of these people. Because some people don't know what their contribution is, because somebody has misinformed or misaligned them or pushed them in the wrong sphere for many years. And then they become effectively the bad apple in the barrel all the time. And yet God has gifted them and they don't know their gifts yet.
Right.
Yeah.
So Paul lists here, starting in verse 7 or 8, all of these gifts, such as healing, miracles, prophecy, distinguishing between spirits, all of these things. But in verse 11, he says that they're empowered by one and the same Spirit, who apportions to each one individually as he wills. How do we even attempt to make sense of that, of the Spirit giving out these gifts as it says he wills? Like where would we begin in understanding how that works?
It's not fair. That's what actually I've heard people say that. It's just, that's not fair.
Yeah. It's the talent story of the talents, that I hear that in.
Exactly.
Why do you get the 5 talents and I got 1? I'd be depressed too. I think, Katie, it's a great question. I think, I think you put your finger on it. So the Spirit gives the gifts. And I think this harkens back to Genesis 1, when it's the Spirit hovering over the waters, and then a human being becomes a human being because the Spirit or the breath of God is breathed into the life. So I think that I think of it I kind of think of it in the same way that we think of our lives themselves are gifts. And I think that's part of what's going on here. And that's why I said it's not just a strengths finder exercise. I think that that's a good starting point. But this is about that, Katie, your life is a gift, not what you do. Now, there are abilities and personalities that flow out of you, but spiritual gifts, we are the gifts. not just some function we play. And I think this is what becomes discouraging, because does the lead singer in the band that Japhet pulls together, should that person feel better than the backup singer, or those of us that merely are good enough to sing in the congregation and not to be, or our voice is less valuable? And I think that's the problem, is we depersonalize in the business world. When we talk about strengths finders, or in our company, we have a phrase called talent acquisition. And I won't get into all of that, but in the business world, we seek talent, we seek skill sets, strengths. In those contexts, we have to be careful that we don't depersonalize one another, because the gifts that we have to offer the world are not our abilities, but ourselves. And ourselves happen to leak out in those abilities. They happen to leak out in those contributions. But I would say that's one place where the church has gotten dangerous at times, where we've read this chapter more as Katie plays the tuba and Japhet plays the trumpet and Alex plays the cello, rather than the problem is people aren't looking at one another as the beautiful gift of God that the Spirit has blown life into. And what's interesting here is the last thing I'll just say on this is that I think that Paul is wishing for them to understand that this one Spirit is blessing a lot further and wider than what they're allowing for.
Mm-hmm.
And it's inclusive. It's inclusive in a way that is much more generous and progressive than their tight view.
I like that a lot, Alex, because I sense in verse 7, when he talks about how the giving of the manifestation of the Spirit is for the common good, there's a purpose behind it. It's not just for you, it's for everyone. And it's much, much bigger than just this personal thing that you bring to the table, just this. And I think we've driven so much about what's your personal contribution to this, that we forget that it's actually about the Spirit driving aside and blessing everybody together for the common good.
Yeah, almost as if we are seeing the things that people do instead of the people who do those things, right?
Yes.
We use the term in CPE, it's not necessarily about one specific thing, it's the experience behind it, right? And so, Japhet, I think you're right. I think a lot of times we look at people based off of, what is your gift doing in, which, isn't necessarily wrong, but I think we could also look at it as, how is God using you? Like, how are you allowing yourself to be used by God? How are we helping you nurture this? Or, or how have you nurtured, that kind of stuff, rather than just looking at like, oh, you're a really good writer, or you're a really good piano. You know what I mean? Like we can acknowledge the fact that God has given somebody this skill set rather than the outcome or the product of those skill set.
And I think, Katie, that if we start to see it in that way that you're talking about, you take off a selfish edge of the way these gifts are blessing us and each other, and you start to realize the potential of belonging to something bigger, and you start to experience joy in this entire process, and people grow in that. And I think that the tension is that when it's about, what is it, my role, what am I supposed to do, how do I get this, how do you, and everything's become so individually tailored. And this is why it's like, don't you worry about it. The Spirit's going to decide what he gives, and he will give like to that, to this, and let God take care of it, right? Because when God takes care of it, it's for the common good. It's for everyone.
And I think you nailed it. And when you were saying, individualized, one of the first things I thought of was like, today now, how much of our lives is on social media or projected for other people to see, and how much of our lives do we spend looking at maybe the way someone else's gift is being used and thinking, oh, I wish I could do that, I wish I could do this. So one of the things I see in this is, they might not have had social media back then, but, I see this as really timely because I heard on a podcast the other day, so many pastors are having a hard time because they are seeing the way someone else is succeeding in what they do. And it causes them to feel stressed. And so I think this is super relevant for right now. Yeah.
Yeah.
Katie,
No,
I
it's
think
true.
you put your finger on something that's really important there. And that's, I think that this passage is loads of grace. One, because it says the Spirit's blowing through all of us, so we should be valuable. But second, I think it lets us off the hook a little bit. Sometimes we feel guilty because it's like, man, I'm just not a prayer warrior like those other people. Or, man, I just don't like sitting in church as much as that other person. Or, just go down the list. And I think that for Christians, for church people, we often, all of us, are in this constant state of guilt because we're not fill in the blank. We're not good at something, or we don't have a proclivity for something, or an activity for something. And this is kind of saying, Alex, Japhet, Katie, you're probably only getting it 1 or 2 or 3. So don't worry about all the other stuff. There's even things in here like prophecy and faith. And think about faith, for example. Some people have the gift of faith, apparently, and others don't. Think about the load of stress that takes off me if I'm not this huge faith warrior that nothing can shake my, whatever. I actually think that there is grace in what it allows us to not have to be.
Right.
Which is, we often say all 28 fundamental beliefs, both testaments of scripture, all theological positions, all aspects of, and pretty soon you're like, I just give up. And I think this passage allows us to live winsomely in those areas where we're called, and to realize God is not asking us to be the A through Z and the Alpha and the Omega. And I like that. I think there's grace and there's relief in this passage.
I agree.
I just put something together that I haven't thought about for years, but in what both of you just said, just hit me that StrengthsFinder talks about how when you have a gift, a strength, right, you should watch out for the shadows. You remember this, that, if you have this particular gift, you may be really exuberant about something, and that's a really great gift, but then watch out for the shadows, because the reverse side, it balances out. You may have this kind of weakness in a particular area. And I remember this gift resource in churches in the 90s that was very popular. I won't say which denominational tribe that shared it, but they were closely connected to the source of where StrengthsFinder came from as well. And they talked about the gifts that churches had, that they said, and then they said that, the Apostle Peter, maybe you're this type of character, or maybe you're Mary, this type of character, but you should watch out because they're not perfect. There's some weakness to the type of person that they are. But what you're talking about, Alex and Katie, is that we shouldn't worry about this thing. You shouldn't worry about the other side. You should just belong to the bigger picture. You should just be inside that space instead of having to try to be absolutely everything and be perfect in everything. Just enjoy the blessing of what you actually bring to the table, because it's actually part of something far bigger than you. And that actually model it's very individual, and this one's very collective. I like it.
Yeah. So speaking of, the collective body, Alex, do you want to go ahead and continue to read the last half of the passage here?
Sure, Katie, beginning in verse 12. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, and all were made to drink of one Spirit. For the body does not consist of one member, but of many. If the foot should say, because I'm not a hand, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less part of the body. And if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I do not belong to the body, that would not make it any less part of the body. If the whole body were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If the whole body were an ear, where would be the sense of smell? But as it is, God arranged the members in the body, each one of them as he chose. If all were a single member, where would the body be? As it is, there are many parts, yet one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you, nor the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, the parts of the body that seem to be weak are indispensable. And on those parts of the body that we think less honorable, we bestow the greater honor, and our unpresentable parts are treated with greater modesty, which our more presentable parts do not require. But God has so composed the body, giving greater honor to the part that lacked it, that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. If one member suffers, all suffer together. If one member is honored, all rejoice together. Now you're the body of Christ and individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, helping, administrating, and various kinds of tongues. Are there apostles? Are there prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? Do all possess gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But earnestly desire the higher gifts, and I will show you still the most excellent way.
So I want to circle back. I think, Alex, you might have mentioned this earlier. I am so curious what was going on in this church that made Paul write this. Right? What prompted this? And so he talks a lot about how, like, you know, saying, I'm not part of this, or this shouldn't belong. I'm so curious about whatever that situation was. Because he says a lot here about this, a lot. I think it's so interesting that he starts with, like, he says here, the foot saying, I'm not a hand, I don't belong. And I think that would be, an interesting point to start here with a part, or you could say a contribution saying, I don't belong. What do you think would make, I guess if we're going to talk about the church body here, what could cause someone to say, I don't belong?
A caste system. A system that they're setting up where there are parts of the body that are more valuable than other parts, which, by the way, Paul gets a little bit salty here if you were reading through, where he talks about some less presentable parts of the body that require clothing. But I mean, that's part of what I read, is there's a taxonomy of importance of body parts. That's the metaphor he's using. So to me, Katie, somehow there is a taxonomy, a caste system of, you're at this level if you're here, and you're down here, and then even further down. So I feel like your question, we don't know precisely what's going on, but we do have a hint even with the language of ethnicity, because there's Jews and Greeks mentioned, slaves and free. So the church is behaving like the Roman Empire, basically, which had a massive caste system where everybody knew your precise place. Roman society was defined by understanding what groups you could not belong to, who you couldn't and could not associate with. Everyone knew their place. And the church is a revolutionary new idea for community that turns all of those societal ideas upside down. And I think what Paul's finding is that the church is acting more like the empire. And the church is supposed to be challenging the assumptions of the empire through its social structures. So that's what I see here is the whole, some body parts are more important to others. Somehow that's how they're functioning.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too, because in verse 16, he says, and if the ear should say, because I'm not an eye, I don't belong, that would not make it any less a part of the body. And then in 17, it says, if the whole body were an eye, where would be the sense of hearing? I think that's a very powerful analogy, because what I love about that is those are both senses. Like when our senses work together is when, like, we can really experience something, right? And so what do you think of, I don't know, that stands out to me. What do you think about that idea? If the ear weren't an eye, you know?
I think he's really, I mean, I think it's a great metaphor, right? It's a living metaphor that everybody will get straight away. And I think it's one of the most beautiful examples that exists outside that Paul kind of paints a fantastic picture of what it means that every part is important. Everything has a place to play inside here, because there is a feeling of not belonging, of not being part of something if you are too small. But you know what it's like, when you cut your finger, and the pain that you have from the cut on the finger that just kind of throbs and it's just there, and you're thinking, that's just such a small paper cut, it's just such a small cut, yet it's intrusive. Or if you hurt your hand, and you suddenly realize when you can't use your hand just how important it is to have your hand, how much you use your hand, and you just take it for granted. And I think there's a sense sometimes that people do feel that they've been taken for granted. And he's saying, look, everybody is valuable. And there's a fear of abandonment. There's a fear of being taken for granted. There's a fear of, being pushed aside, and that some parts feel like, that's actually more important. And I think he's trying to level it. He's saying, like Alex said, the church, the community, the faith community is countercultural. It should be a different space. And some of our faith tribes, some of our communities have actually been able to do that, and some have not. Some have just emulated in structure, in function, in the way that we do business as a church. You couldn't really tell the difference between Wall Street and the church. And not to say everything in Wall Street is bad, but just to say there is a structure.
Mm-hmm.
I love your example. I was thinking about a toothache, Japhet. It was a little bit different than the one you were using, but I was thinking about, I had a horrible toothache, I don't know, 6 weeks ago, and I was traveling. And you know what the problem is? That one little nerve, that one little part of your body,
Mm-hmm.
and it colors everything else that you do.
Yep.
Like your whole body
Yeah.
suffers, and I think that, so I was thinking, well, what would cause that little toothache to not impact the rest of my body? And the way it would be either if it was not my tooth and it was your tooth, or if I anesthetized it so much that I tried to convince myself through the numbing of the nerve that tooth had nothing to do with my body. I think you see where I'm going with this.
Yes.
But the church apparently doesn't care about the one suffering member, if you will, because they've decided either that member is not a part of the body and therefore it doesn't hurt me, or through some kind of numbing, they have tricked themselves in deciding that family, that group of people with that color of skin, those folks over there that are in that economic position, or those somehow they have come up of a way of thinking that the rest of the body's not being hurt, even though that part of the body's being hurt. And I just think that's part of what's going on too, Katie. We're guessing, you ask us to guess about the backstory. One is, I think you've got that, as I mentioned, I think the caste system is going on. But second, I think this illustration to me suggests that if there's a part of the church that's hurting and it doesn't seem to be bothering everybody, then you've done something to disassociate them from the body, because pain actually is the right signal. When you and I feel, when you and I feel bad to the point of being motivated to do something about it because somebody in our community is hurting or suffering, that's a sign that we see them as part of the body. See, and I think, and I think Paul's looking for a social integration in his language here with the language of one body. And certainly I understand he's using the language of church, but I want to suggest that this does not end at the gates of church membership, because church was thought of much more in terms of how it was blessing the whole community at the time. So anyway, I'll stop there, but that was the metaphor I was thinking about, is just when one part of your body hurts, even a little tooth, it should hurt all of us.
I would love to know how we can really let people know that they are, as he says here in verse 22, that they are not indispensable.
Yeah.
So I think that that message that you are indispensable actually comes across way too often. And I think that happens in all spheres. Happens in work, in life, in relationships, in church. And I think, you know, it should be something that we are proactively working towards all the time, to say everybody's valuable.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, that's a good point, because there's nothing like either being told that your contribution to something doesn't have value, or
Mm-hmm.
you know, I think of, you know, you see it in the movies too, and you know, this happens where like you're picking teams, right, in like PE class or something, you know, and you can, you know, I've been one of those kids, one of the last ones, who you can see people thinking, okay, who's here is going to have more value to this team. Like, that's tough. That's
I thought you
tough.
were going to say, Katie, that you were the captain,
Oh,
picking everybody and thinking.
no, I was never the captain. Are you kidding? No.
Oh,
But no, but
what?
like it's tough. And it's,
Yeah,
even if
it
it's
is.
something as like a game at recess, or, you know,
Mm-hmm.
an experience of having a church congregation say, you know, you don't contribute, like that's a tough thing. And so I agree, Japhet. How do we be more proactive about that?
That moment, Katie, that you just talked about, that actually, it happens to kids all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just like, I mean, it's just, I think you think about it, you know, and if you see it happen to kids, and you see it happen in the playground and in recess, playground, recess, that's the two terms there, but you see it happening, you think about how much they have to overcome, and they just go home and they have to continue pressing
Right.
on, but it's rejection.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
unnecessary rejection. And you just think, why do people have to do this? Why do
Yeah.
people have to, why do they have to reject, you know? Surely, and it's just, that's horrible. I'm with you.
And I see a connection between that and what Alex was saying earlier about like, this frees us from feeling that need to be everything and do everything. Because if you have this sense of rejection from whatever it is, then, you know, you start to wonder, should I have done something different? Could I do something more? So that kind of can motivate people to almost feel like they have to make up for that, which then could drive into this cycle of needing to be everything, do everything, kind of this maybe perfectionistic cycle, which then can cause this tension, right? And so I absolutely agree with what Alex was saying earlier. This is something that frees us from feeling like we have to constantly be proving our worth, as you know, as if our actions determine what our gift is, right? So I agree. I see a connection between those 2 points, that, you know, we are the gifts because we're there. That's what it is. And yeah, I don't know.
It is easy to be rejected, but there comes points where somebody who's been rejected becomes the person who can choose.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's on them to make sure they don't reject,
Right.
and to break the cycle.
I agree.
And I think about the disciples, right? It just, I mean, as you were saying that, I was thinking, wow, the disciples had the opportunity. They were rejected. They had not become disciples, right?
Mm-hmm.
They were other careers, and now they got accepted and they got pulled in. And then when, you know, Jesus ascended, the Spirit came down, they had the opportunity to accept more, and yet they pushed. And it wasn't until Acts 12 where the Spirit really came and said, come on. The kingdom is bigger, and they're like, all right, we'll widen it up, because it's easy to have been rejected, but then when you're in the seat of power, to suddenly say, actually, I want to keep the doors closed. And we have to remember that when you have the opportunity to actually make sure that the door that was open for you, you open for others as well.
Exactly.
That's really just, I think the conversation that the two of you have engaged in the last minute is spot on. And I think when you talk about power, I think that we've actually used the theology of spiritual gifts to do precisely what it wasn't intended for at times, which is we give more power to elders than we give to deacons, than we have a taxonomy of gifts.
Yes.
Which the Protestant tradition has claimed to war against, right? To push against. But in our church tradition, the Adventist church, we have a hierarchy of giftedness. In the local church, we have it in the church more generally, in the structure of the church. And I think these positions become positions of power, and people feel at distance or nearness to God based on how they relate to those positions. And I think even at a ground level, I think just how much time you give to the church becomes an issue, where we claim that the ball field for giftedness is what you do for about a 2.5 hour period on Sabbath morning on the church grounds. Yeah. Why don't we talk to the young mom with kids and go, don't serve.
Yes.
You got time off. Your job for the next 3 years is just to be a great mom. Why don't we say, I'm just using that as one example, but I would love to see pastors, and I attempted to do this at times when I was pastoring a local church, but we need to free people up to understand that if you are a mechanic, if you're a physician, if you are a teacher, whatever you're doing, the tentacles of the church are wherever you go, because you embody the church. And your giftedness is not what you do for 2.5 hours that appears on that nominating committee list. What you do 50 hours a week at your job is also part of this mix. It's your whole life and the whole way that you're living. So I don't know. I know I raised a couple of different components to this, but I think that, again, I think that historically the church has sometimes done the exact opposite of what this passage is trying to do by creating its own hierarchy of gifts with authority. And I would say even the language of offices that we use tips towards a bit of a problem, because an office implies some things that it starts to imply some things that can dangerously move us away from relationship and into who's in charge of who.
A role.
Right.
A role. And Japhet, I think a role that controls other people's roles. And I'm not arguing for anarchy here. I'm not suggesting, that authority doesn't matter and that there has to be systems of governance in the church. I'm not suggesting that at all. But I think what happens is it does become spiritualized. It does become something that impacts our souls when we speak about it either sloppily or wrongly. And I just think we have to, the whole intent of this passage is what the two of you have been describing: inclusion, care, compassion, affirmation, celebrating what God is breathing into our lives. It's not about, well, what's the order of authority and who's in and out, who's controlling, who serves in the church. And then think about the fights that happen in local church life when such and such has this position or they don't. And so I think sometimes we fall into that just because we're maybe a little clumsy in how we interpret a passage like this.
Yeah. Can I add on to that too? Do you think it's possible, and this is kind of a rhetorical question here, that sometimes we try to, how do I word this? Determine someone else's either gift or use of their gift ahead of time? Like, so for example, we see in somebody, like, or in our observation, oh, you would be great at, administration, right? You should really, really do this. So how do you balance encouraging someone and like nurturing their gift compared to, I don't want to say pushing somebody into something, but maybe that's the right word. But so how do you balance like seeing something in someone comparing to really compelling them into doing something for maybe a benefit of something. Do you get what I'm asking here? It's not
Yes.
very specific, but
No,
yeah.
I think I do. I think it, and tell me if this is what you're kind of pushing us into. Are you saying that how do you make sure that we are being faithful to the gifts that they've been bestowed upon,
Yeah.
as opposed to the agendas
Yes.
that we may have,
Yes.
right?
Exactly.
And that's a fine line. It's a fine line, because I think that's you have to honestly, for those in the leadership roles, you have to honestly be looking at the heart of the person. I had this personal philosophy when I was pastoring churches, that if somebody came to me as a leader and they said, "Hey, I'm a little bit exhausted, or I'm just really busy, or I think that I should like step down from role," my general counsel to them was always that I think that they should just take a sabbatical. They shouldn't step down from the role. They should take a sabbatical, and we should cover them, because everybody needs to take a break and a breather and breathe and refresh their soul and replenish themselves. And they should just not be working from that space inside there. And sometimes that sabbatical can be a long time. Sometimes it can be a short time. But I don't know whether we flex like that, because Jesus did that with his disciples. He gave the freedom to some to kind of like, hey, you need a bit more space. You need some movement inside that. And I think we need to be cognizant of the person and the common good, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because the common good is built up of all these people together, and that's what the Spirit does inside them. But it comes down to motive.
I think, and Katie, I think too, just flipping it, I think that the individual can have motives too that arise. So I think your example is a good one, where maybe someone is trying to guilt or manipulate someone into serving in some way or not serving in some way. But it's also the case. So now I'm going to take the other side here.
Do it.
That maybe Sister Jones shouldn't be the one singing the solo up front, because everyone that's listening to Sister Jones is begging for the song to be done.
Sorry, I actually know who you're talking about.
And no, hear me, is begging for Sister Jones to be done, and everyone is cringing, and because everyone wants to be nice but not kind, and there's a difference between being nice and being kind. Everyone just wants to be nice and not say anything. But how would you feel if you were doing something constantly and everyone was snickering or gossiping or biting down on a stick while you were doing it, but no one ever told you?
Right.
It doesn't respect Sister Jones. So I think one is that there's definitely that the community affirms gifts. That's in here. And we'll see that when we get to chapter 14 with speaking in tongues, that the church needs to play a role in affirming gifts. And I think sometimes when someone is claiming that this is what I'm supposed to be doing, there is a role for the church to play, either in saying, Sister Jones, you can't really carry a tune, but you bake the best apple pie that anybody's ever baked in this church, and we're going to leverage those apple pies to do good in the world. Yeah. Or it could be an attitudinal issue where you might have the best lead singer up front that's just crushing it and everything, but they're not a good person. They don't treat people well. Their motivations are all screwed up. And it may be time to say that the church might need to say through the elders, again, through the appropriate channel, but the appropriate thing might be to say, we got to step away here. So that's the other side I would say, Katie, is I think motivations all the way around, there has to be maturity brought to this.
And there's even another side of it. People who are aware of their gifts and their perception of their gifts and use that as intentionally as an agenda against another group or another person. So there's even a
Mhm.
whole other dimension of that. And back to what you're saying, it takes that maturity and that kind of awareness, the difference between being nice and kind. That, yeah, Alex, I think you're correct with that. I think you're correct. So I think it's really interesting in verse 29, because Paul says, are all apostles? Are all prophets? Are all teachers? Do all work miracles? And he lists all these things. And I think that, when I read that, I wonder if his audience read, well, am I an apostle? Am I a prophet? Am I a teacher? So my thought on that thing is just that I wonder if he's getting people to reflect, but I'm curious, what are your thoughts with this combination of questions here that he finishes off the chapter with?
My hunch is that there are people who say there are people who are saying, I should be the teacher. I should be the miracle worker. I should be. How come you haven't asked me to do this stuff? And I think it's the same way that. And Agus and I have had this discussion once when we were in a museum about how you can go in to see a piece of art, right? And you look at the art and you think to yourself, well, that's great and inspiring, and you can take it for what it is and just be in awe of it. Or you can say, well, is that great? I could have done that myself. I mean, paintbrush, palette. I mean, what's so great about this art? And the thing is, the difference is that you didn't do it. You didn't do it. The artist did it. You're talking about doing it. And so there are those who yak and talk about it all the time and say, just give me. And there are those who actually do, who give and use the things that God has given them and belong to the collective, the community at large. And I think he's trying to push and say, look, again, chill, relax. God has called all of us. Not everybody has to do all the stuff. It's that's where I think it is, Katie. That's kind of like where I lean is that space.
Yeah, I think that's about right. I think that I would come back to the limitations.
Mm-hmm.
That limitations can be quite good news. People say, man, I can't wait to get to heaven, because when I get to heaven, Katie, I am finally going to sing like Michael Bublé or Josh Groban, or I'm sure I'm picking all the wrong voices right now, but we hear this, right? When I get to heaven, and what do people say? It's basically like, I'll have all the spiritual gifts in heaven. That's what they say. That's what we say. When I get to heaven, man, just wait till. And the problem is, Paul is so what is that? That makes me a church unto myself. See, do you know what's really exciting? What's really exciting is when you can't sing great and you're blown away by the mystery of how somebody can.
Yeah.
Yes.
Let me tell you. You know what the worst thing is about being a preacher? You can't ever listen to a sermon anymore because you're unpacking, because you know how the sausage is made.
Yeah.
It's I've heard somebody in the film business talk about they can never enjoy a movie because they're thinking about where all the camera placements are, and they're thinking about all the lighting and how the director's putting it together. The great things that we really enjoy in life can be the things that we actually don't do well at all, because mystery is heaven itself. And I'll tell you, I don't want to sing like the angels when I get to heaven, because then forevermore, the mystery of what it's like to actually sing like that would be robbed of you. So I just think some of this, again, I read these texts pastorally, not just as these kind of heavy Paul is cracking down.
Mm-hmm.
I think Paul is freeing us to just enjoy somebody's leadership or someone's counseling or someone's ability to paint a great picture or bake that apple pie or sing or do amazing kids ministry or organize things. Or I just love it. I love to watch other people do great things that I can't do. And I think that Paul is trying to unleash that ability, because then I can love you and you can love me, and we can just enjoy the way that we've each been given a gift. So I think there's just big stuff in here that would be transformative, not only for the church, but it would be transformative for our souls, because so much of our lives, we wake up in the morning and we look in the mirror and we judge ourselves because we can't do A, B, or C. And if we would just enjoy who we were made to be and love the wonder of what somebody else is wired up to do, I just think we'd like life a lot better.
Yeah, and there's nothing like being part of a group or, working on a team with people who know their skill set or their spiritual gift and enjoy it and just thrive in it, and then encourage others to do the same in whatever their gift is. There's nothing like that. So
because they're not threatened, they're excited for it. They actually lift everybody else up. I'm with you, Katie, on that. That's so true. Yeah.
Well, lots of good stuff here in this chapter. There's a lot here. This has been a great conversation. We made it to the end of the chapter, so that's great. So we hope you all have enjoyed this. Before we head over to Extra Salt, Japhet, do you have anything you want to share with us about anything coming up?
Yeah, absolutely. We are nearly there. Paddy and I are nearly there to head out and prep for the work that's needed for the One Project gathering that's going to be this October. And so we are excited for putting that together. We are excited for the theme and the vision of that. Subtle hint there to my colleague, Alex.
It's percolating.
It's percolating so well.
Actually, we do have a concept we're working on. And I will just say, it is categorically unlike anything that we've done before. And,
I know.
And I cannot wait.
Really, I couldn't tell.
No. It's we're actually super excited about it. But we're ready for that. So after we prayed, I'll give instructions and bring everybody over to Extra Salt. So
okay. I'll go ahead and say prayer.
Okay.
God, thank you for this day. Thank you for the words and the messages conveyed through today's passage. We learned lots, and most importantly, we learned lots about who you are and how you give us gifts that make us unique, and how we can encourage other people to use those gifts, and how that, when that is collaborated, is one of the most beautiful experiences. I thank you for each and every person who joined us today, whenever they joined us or wherever they joined us from. God, I thank you for each one of them. I pray a special blessing of peace for them at this time, God, and thank you so much for all that you have done for us and will continue to do for us. In your name we pray, amen.
Amen. So friends, if you are on one of the other platforms, Facebook or Vimeo or YouTube or, the One Project website or our app, blessings to you. Have a really amazing remainder of your Sabbath. And if you're somewhere else in the other part of the world, then enjoy your Sunday morning, early Sunday morning. We who are here on the One Project channel, we're going to stay on for Extra Salt. You're welcome to join us. Just click the link down below there, Extra Salt. It's effectively a time for tea and biscuits, effectively. Come by, switch on your camera, and we'll love to see your faces, hear your voices, and have just a few minutes to be able to kind of catch up on the week ahead. God bless you, and we will see you soon.